I need you to stop what you're doing and go read A Letter to America.
The actions of 9/11 and those acts committed against the USA and its people were all just a buildup of our government failing other nations.
Parts of it read like a radical left-wing manifesto against alleged US imperialism. But it was in fact written by the world's most infamous terrorist. Millions of young liberal Americans took to TikTok last week to watch videos praising Osama Bin Laden's letter to America penned in 2002 to justify 9/11. The TikTokers said the Al-Qaeda mastermind's 8-page diatribe had turned their world upside down and sparked an existential crisis, while others added simply, "He was right." All seemingly in aid of their view that the United States should end its full-throated support for Israel in its war against Hamas. But why and how did supposedly liberal-minded Americans get taken in by a terrorist screed littered with anti-Semitic tropes, homophobia, and religious intolerance? You may already be familiar with how the drama over Bin Laden's letter played out, but just in case you missed it, here is a very quick recap. It began Tuesday last week, when Google data showed interest in the letter spiked. On Wednesday, that interest manifested in TikTok videos where users urged their followers to read it. Thursday, it spread to Twitter, where it caused outcry before TikTok began pulling the videos and the Guardian newspaper removed a version of the letter on its site, saying it was being shared without context. So, what exactly is the context of the letter? What does it actually say? And why did a bunch of young and supposedly liberal-minded Americans fall for it? It was published in November 2002, just over a year after the US invaded Afghanistan to hunt down Bin Laden in revenge for 9/11 and to destroy the Taliban which sheltered him. Paranoia was high. Nobody knew where or when the next attack might come from. A series of attacks on US officials using letters laced with anthrax had gone unsolved, and George W. Bush was just starting to make the case for war with Iraq. And everyone was trying to answer the question, why and how did all of this happen? The letter was an attempt to answer both of those questions by blaming America for the creation of Israel and decades of wars in the Middle East, among dozens of other gripes and grievances, which we will come to later. But the first important bit of context is we're not even certain that Bin Laden wrote it. At the time, he was the world's most wanted man, pursued across the deserts of Afghanistan by America, and it wasn't clear whether he was alive or dead. So when a letter appeared on a Saudi website used by Al-Qaeda to disseminate its extremist propaganda that contained justifications for attacks on American civilians, everyone assumed it was penned by Bin Laden to justify 9/11 and prove he was still breathing. But differences in the writing style and topics discussed have led some to conclude that another Al-Qaeda leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, may have penned it instead. Others theorize that at least part of the letter may have been written by Adam Gaddan, a California-born Al-Qaeda convert who moved to Pakistan and earned notoriety as the group's English-language spokesman. But assuming for the moment that it was written by Bin Laden, it provides one of the most detailed insights into his mindset that exists today. To understand that mindset, however, we need to understand the man who was supposedly behind the letter. The first and most important thing to know about Bin Laden is that he wasn't always an avowed terrorist. The son of a billionaire construction mogul with close ties to the Saudi royal family, the young Osama grew up in a world of money and privilege in a Middle East that was in many ways more Western and more modern than the one we know today. Picture Bin Laden, and you will almost certainly conjure an image of the bearded, turban-wearing extremist, a far cry from the bell-bottom-wearing 15-year-old seen here alongside 22 of his reported 50 siblings on a family holiday to Sweden in 1971. Which begs the question, how on earth did he go from this to the man who would kill thousands of people in the deadliest terror attack ever on US soil? The answer is that in 1979, two events took place that drastically changed the political climate in the Middle East and paved the way for Bin Laden's descent into the radical ideology he espoused in the letter. The first was the Iranian Revolution, which saw hardline religious clerics seize power from the Western-backed Shah and threaten to spread their revolution globally. Fearful of being toppled in similar coups, other Middle Eastern leaders, including in Bin Laden's native Saudi Arabia, became more hardline as a way of protecting themselves. Second, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, kicking off a decade-long conflict that saw thousands of young men from outside the country join the Mujahideen in resisting the communist takeover. Bin Laden was one of them, fresh out of university where he met and was inspired by the likes of Abdullah Azzam, considered a founding father of global jihadism, and Muhammad Qutb, brother of Sayyid Qutb, an Islamist and leading figure in the Muslim Brotherhood. It was on the battlefields of Afghanistan, where the Mujahideen were supported by Pakistani, Saudi and American secret services in their fight against the commies, that Bin Laden's radicalization gathered pace. When he emerged from that war, he was both a religious man deeply opposed to foreign meddling in the Middle East and a proud fighter in possession of a database of Islamist warriors which would become the foundation of Al-Qaeda, whose name, literally translated, means the base. But he soon fell out with the Saudi royals, who rightly identified him as a radical and a troublemaker, particularly after they refused to use his Mujahideen network to defend the country against the threat of invasion by Saddam Hussein's Iraq during the First Gulf War. Instead, the House of Saud turned to the US, who they invited to build military bases across the country, sidelining Bin Laden and his paramilitaries. It was an insult he never forgot, and the following years saw him fully transformed from bell-bottom teenager into turban-wearing terrorist. No longer welcome in his home country, Bin Laden fled to Sudan, where he developed the basis of Al-Qaeda ideology, which preached violent resistance to what he saw as US attempts to dominate the Middle East and establish training camps for his fighters. Thrown out of Sudan in 1996, he went back to Afghanistan, where the Taliban, which had seized power earlier the same year, took him under their protection. There, he issued a fatwa declaring holy war on the US with the goal of drawing America into a devastating war in the Middle East that would overthrow the existing world order and lead to the establishment of an Islamic state. All of which brings us neatly back to the letter to America, in which he attempted to explain that ideology to Americans confused about why exactly he had orchestrated the worst terror attack in their history. The letter sets out to answer two questions. Why is Al-Qaeda fighting America? And what does it want to achieve? There are parts of both answers that seem likely to appeal to young people on the so-called woke left, but their sympathy appears to hinge on only a partial reading of the text. In justifying his war, Bin Laden argues the US attacked first, a conflict he traces all the way back to the British Mandate of Palestine, which began after the First World War, continues through the creation of Israel in 1948, and includes all of the wars fought over it since. He also blames the US for plundering the Middle East's oil wealth, for establishing military bases in the region, and for propping up what he sees as corrupt Arab governments, among plenty of other grievances. In answering the second question, Bin Laden calls the US a hypocrite over its human rights record, accuses it of starting wars for economic benefit, and of creating laws that only benefit the rich. He even hammers their environmental record and describes the United States as the worst civilization in the history of mankind. A lot of which chimes with modern-day left-wing narratives about settler colonialism, institutional racism, and American imperialism, and helps to explain how the TikTokers were suckered in. But what they either ignore, or perhaps more troublingly, embrace, are the deeply anti-Semitic narratives that Bin Laden weaves through his argument. He also explicitly calls for the rejection of all religions except Islam and the establishment of Sharia law, which includes renouncing intoxicants, gambling, and homosexuality, which hardly chimes with the politics of the progressive left. There is plenty more in the letter besides, which runs to 8 full pages, but that is enough to give you a gist of what appears to have turned the TikTokers' worlds upside down, and what they are either ignorant of or implicitly accept when they say things like, "he was right." Of course, the letter did not re-emerge into a vacuum, and what inspired these people to dig it up is the war currently unfolding in Gaza. In the wake of Israel's attack on Hamas, prompted by the massacre of 1,200 Israeli civilians on October 7th, there has been an outpouring of support for Palestinians throughout the West, particularly among young people. Thousands have taken to the streets in mass demonstrations that have been held in London, New York, and elsewhere. But along with that has come a troubling rise in anti-Semitism, which has particularly affected university campuses, where Jewish students report feeling unsafe. That helps to explain why the TikTok trend, which in truth was only a fringe issue on the site, was so disturbing. Here were young people uncritically spreading deeply anti-Semitic propaganda while encouraging their millions of followers to do the same, in an apparent attempt to bring it into the mainstream. Ever since Russia declared war on Ukraine, now with conflict raging in the Middle East, and with the threat of a third war looming in the Pacific, Western world order has felt under serious threat for the first time in decades. But until now, that threat has seemed to come entirely from overseas. However, the TikTok story has left people with the lingering feeling that the danger might also be brewing much closer to home.